Hey, this is Kip, and in this video, we're going to learn how to fly an ILS, or Instrument Landing System, approach in Microsoft Flight Sim 2020. So what we're looking at here is an instrument approach procedure document, or approach plate, it's also called. And this is for the Long Beach runway 30 approach. Up here you can see that's for the ILS approach for runway 30. And this document is how you prepare for an approach procedure like an ILS approach. Now, an ILS is composed of two different radio emitting pieces of equipment that are on the airfield. One of them is called the localizer. And you can see the localizer label here with the radio frequency 110.3. And you can see this line that points down to this miniature airport diagram here. This area here represents the path that we're flying to land at the runway. If we look closer, these two shaded areas here, one's empty and one is shaded. That represents the two different overlapping radio frequencies that are transmitted by the localizer. That's how the aircraft knows whether it's too far to the right and needs to correct left, or if it's too far to the left, it needs to correct to the right to be lined up with the runway. The other component that's installed, usually at the front of the runway, is called the glide slope. And in this area, this is showing basically a side view as if you're standing on the ground. And this little black line here is the runway. And this shaded area here represents the glide slope radio transmission that's happening. And the glide slope provides the vertical guidance. When we're actually flying the ILS, we only need to know the localizer frequency, which in this case is 110.3. It's also shown here in the top left of the document, the very top left box. So we can tune our navigation radio using the Garmin 530 or 430 and get the horizontal guidance, which will line us up with the runway. The glide slope frequency or glide path frequency is automatically known to our equipment because it's standardized and based on the localizer frequency. Another important thing for us to look at are the fixes or waypoints that are along our approach course. So this black line here represents the course that we'll be flying. And along it, you can see there are a few waypoints: mids, lucig, and gunny. So you can see when we hit mids, we'll be making a right-hand turn to go to lucig, and then we'll be straight on to gunny, and then continuing straight again to land at the runway up here. Mids is a special waypoint because it's noted with this IAF abbreviation, which means initial approach fix. And that tells us where our approach procedure starts. What it also shows us here is that at mids, we need to be at exactly 4,000 feet. There's a bar above and below the 4,000. So that means we need to be no higher than and no lower than 4,000 feet. Now, if we look at the bottom of the chart, there's this area here. This is called the profile view. And what this shows us are our waypoints. You can see gunny right here. And it shows us what altitudes we need to be at each waypoint. So in the case of gunny, you can see we need to be at 1,600 feet. So once we get to that point, we can expect to have the glide slope radio transmission in range and be able to see our vertical guidance on our instruments. And in case you've been wondering, can you have the airplane fly the ILS for you using autopilot? And the answer is yes. And yes, it's awesome. And that's what we're going to do in this video. So the most important things to remember from this document for our flight to land at Long Beach is that we need the localizer frequency 110.3. And we need to remember that mids is our initial approach fix. So that starts our approach procedure. And we will pass by lucig and then finally gunny. But when we get to gunny, we need to remember that we need to be precisely at 1,600 feet altitude. So we're going to go ahead and jump in the aircraft and then we'll start flying this. Okay, so I've gone ahead and chosen Chino as my departure airport and Long Beach as my arrival. And when you plan a flight using the world map, the default type of flight is a VFR flight that is direct with GPS. And you can see that listed right here in this dropdown. Now, VFR stands for Visual Flight Rules. And what that means is that we don't rely on our instruments to fly the plane. It means that we're flying under a rule set that says that we need to be able to observe everything that's happening outside the cockpit with our eyes. So that means you don't fly through clouds or other low visibility scenarios. You don't fly in situations where you can't observe terrain and obstructions and air traffic that may be around you. IFR, on the other hand, stands for Instrument Flight Rules, and as you may have guessed, that is flying with your instruments, which means you could fly without really looking out of the windows of the aircraft. And what comes with IFR flight planning is a very specific flight plan with multiple waypoints that are standardized waypoints, and air traffic control has a specific plan for where you should be at any time during your flight, and they'll know exactly how you're getting to where you're going. That also means that air traffic control is going to be constantly communicating with you during your flight. They're going to tell you when to turn certain directions, what altitude to climb or descend to, and when, and things like that. So we'll actually see that happen visually as soon as we change from a direct VFR flight to an IFR flight. And there are two options here. And for us, since we're flying the Cessna 172, it has a ceiling or maximum altitude of 14,000 feet. So in that case, we're going to choose low altitude, which in the United States covers everything under 18,000 feet. And if you're curious, low altitude airways are also referred to as the Victor Airways in the United States. And high altitude airways are referred to as jet airways, and those are above 18,000 feet. So you can see now that I've chosen an IFR flight plan that it's automatically changed our plan to follow a few waypoints. So we have this one here, KO, Jog It, and SLI. Those are between our departure and arrival airports. And this is what I was talking about when I said that an IFR flight plan is very specific. These are using standardized waypoints, so we don't just go wherever we want. We're flying to specific waypoints, and air traffic control knows where we'll be at any moment. Also, when we pick IFR, you'll notice that we have 3 new drop-downs at the top of the screen. These are our procedures: departures, arrivals, and approach. Departures and arrivals are for another time, but we're gonna cover the approach here. And as you can see, there's an ILS approach at Long Beach, like we discussed, ILS for runway 30. As soon as I click on that for our approach, you'll see this magenta line that represents the approach. You may notice that there are some points where there are turns, but there's no waypoint shown, and that's just because of the default filters on the world map. And you can reveal these waypoints by going to Open Filters at the bottom menu, and then scrolling to the bottom and enabling the Fix and RNAV positions. And now when you zoom in, you can see that MIDS is visible here at that turn. Right here we have Lucig, and then up here we have Gunny. So as expected, that matches the approach plate or the approach document that we looked at the beginning of the video. Now you can modify this flight plan if you want to by clicking any of these waypoints and then removing them. So in this case, it'd be a lot nicer to just go directly from Chino Airport here to Jog It and then to MIDS, so we'd shave a little time off of our flight. Okay, so now we have our flight plan from Chino to Long Beach with the approach ILS 30. I'm gonna go ahead and load into the sim. All right, here we are loaded in. I just loaded in directly onto the runway. I'm gonna hit Control 2 to go look at our Garmin 530. And if you hit the FPL button on the bottom, we can see our flight plan is loaded. What you may not have seen before is that it now breaks up each section of our flight with these teal colored headings. So we have en route, then it shows our en route waypoints. So from takeoff, those are the points we're passing until we get to our approach. And then here are waypoints for our approach. And like we saw in the approach document, we can see MIDS, Lucig, and then Gunny. This user waypoint here, I think is in the sim just to complete that right-hand turn for us that's in the flight plan. So I'm gonna take off and I'm gonna use our autopilot to fly this GPS route for us as normal. And if you don't know how to fly GPS route with autopilot, go ahead and check the GPS flight planning tutorial. So now we're on our way using our GPS flight plan. And this will take us all the way to MIDS, M-I-D-D-S, which is that waypoint we looked at before. Now, if you want a better view of your flight plan, I definitely recommend pressing the V key on your keyboard or clicking up here, VFR map, to enable it. If for some reason any of these windows aren't visible when you enable them, you can go to the gear here and click on Reset Panels. And that'll bring it into view once you open it again. There we go. So we can see in our flight plan that we'll come up to this waypoint, jog it, and then after that we'll be at mids. And we need to remember that when we get to mids, that's the start of our ILS approach. Once it finishes that right-hand turn, I'm going to switch us from using GPS to using VLOC mode on our Garmin 530. You can see here that it's currently in GPS mode, and that will bring us to the mids waypoint. And then if we keep following those waypoints, it'll actually still line us up with that runway. But we're not going to use a GPS approach. We're going to be using the ILS approach, which is radio based. And when we use the ILS approach, we not only get the horizontal guidance to line us up with the runway, but we will also get vertical guidance. And we'll use the autopilot to do both of those for us and take us down on our precision approach right down to the runway. So what we're going to do now is prepare for our approach. And since we're using the ILS approach, what I'm going to do is tune our VLOC, this is our navigation radio frequency, VOR or localizer frequency. And we're going to tune the active frequency to the ILS localizer frequency. And we're going to just go ahead and tune it now because it's the only one that we're using during our flight. Now I could go back and look at the approach plate that we looked at the beginning of the video to find that frequency, but say I forgot it. How can I find it just using the 530? Well, all I have to do is go ahead to the second page, which is the waypoint page. This will let us look up information on any waypoint. And then I'm going to click the push button down here to enable the cursor and enter KLGB for Long Beach Airport. And then we can scroll to page 3 of this and we'll get the relevant radio and navigation frequencies for Long Beach Airport. And the ILS is at the very bottom of this list, so I'll turn on the cursor and scroll all the way down. And here we see ILS for runway 30 is 110.3. So I just hit enter here, and that puts it into our standby field for the VLOC or the navigation radio. Then I can just hit this V button right here on the left to make it active. And you'll see when I do that, we're actually close enough to the Long Beach Airport where it's already found that we're tuned into the Long Beach localizer or VOR, and right here we can see the code ILGB, and that's actually shown inside the approach plate document as well next to the frequency, and that's how we know that we're tuned into the correct frequency and also within range of it already. A second way that we can confirm we're tuned into the correct frequency is by listening to the Morse code that actually comes through our radio. So this is our nav1 radio. So up here at the top, I can just enable nav1 and you can hear the beeps. So that pattern, that Morse code pattern, is a second way of making sure that we're tuned into the right frequency. So if we listen to that pattern and compare it with what's in the approach plate next to the word localizer, it'll have dots and dashes, and we can compare what we hear to what we see and confirm that the pattern is correct.
Descend and maintain 4,000 feet. Expect ILS runway 30 approach by MIDDS transition cleared to MIDDS Cessna Kilo India Papa.
So we just got instructions from air traffic control to go ahead and descend to 4,000 feet, so we're going to do that. So I just set the autopilot to take us down vertical speed mode to 4,000 feet. If you ever miss anything that air traffic control says to you, remember you can go up, turn on the ATC window, and then review it. So we're only 5 miles away from the mids waypoint, and we're about to level off at 4,000 feet altitude, which is what they told us. And we need to remember that by the time we get to the waypoint Gunny, which is right here, we need to be at 1,600 feet to make sure that we can intercept the glide slope.
SoCal approach on 12. Cessna November 20 Kilo India Papa SoCal approach, continue to mids as planned. Altimeter 29.83.
29.83 for our altimeter, so I'm going to go ahead and update that. So I update it here, There's 2980, and if I roll my mouse wheel 3 more times, that should be 2983. And then we also have to update that using the BARO button down here, BARO. So when I hit BARO, you see it's in a different unit of measurement. This is in hectopascals, which is used like in Europe. We need to press and hold the BARO button until it says in HG, inches in mercury, and then change it to 2983 by rolling the dial. There we go. So now the altitude that our autopilot is using is also accurate. All right, so we're finishing our right-hand turn here. You can see that we passed mids. You can see how this user waypoint here. That's an air traffic control instruction for another aircraft.
Kilo India Papa descend and maintain 3,000 feet.
They want us to descend and maintain 3,000. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that.
Descend and maintain 3,000 feet, Cessna Kilo India Papa.
So I'm actually gonna leave it because I know that after we hit 3,000 feet, they're not gonna give us another instruction, and I wanna make sure we get down to 1,600 in time.
Horizon Air 2399er have the Cessna Skyhawk in sight.
And we're almost done. We're gonna make another right turn here on our way to Lusig, which is our next waypoint. And remember, the waypoint after that is Gunny, and we need to be at 1,600 feet. Okay, now that we can see the airport in the distance and we're lined up, I'm gonna go ahead and switch to use the localizer for our horizontal and vertical guidance. Because we already have it programmed in here, 110.3, we just go ahead and click this CDI button down here, and that changes us to VLOC mode. You can see it turning us to line us up even more accurately with the runway.
Cleared ILS runway 30 approach.
All right, they just cleared us for the ILS 30. 2983 altimeter, which is the same, so we do not need to update the altimeter. And we're still descending a little bit because of the autopilot settings I put in. Now, what we need to look at now is this instrument right here. This is the ILS instrument. This line right here, the vertical line, shows us if we're on course or not, to the left or to the right. If it was left, that means we need to go left. If it's to the right, we need to go right. Because we're using autopilot though, it's centered. This vertical line is our glide slope indicator, and it's coming down towards the middle, which is good. That means that we're below the altitude that we need to be at when we get to Gunny. So this is gonna intercept in the middle, and when it does, it's actually gonna be captured. I'm gonna hit approach down here, very important. So I hit approach on the autopilot right here to put us in approach mode. And as soon as this line hits the center here, it's gonna capture the glide slope, and our vertical guidance will be automatically followed by our autopilot. So you can see we're at minus 200 feet per minute. That's about to change because it's about to capture the glide slope. Watch here in just a second. This is gonna start moving. There it goes. So now that's how we have our confirmation that the glide slope is captured, and our autopilot is using the glide slope to handle our angle of descent. So now we're actually hands off. We don't have to do anything other than manage our throttle and our flaps until we get down within a few hundred feet of the runway. So I'm gonna put in my first notch of flaps. Now I'm gonna pull our throttle back a bit, because when we land, we want to be around 70 knots or so. So you may notice that we're actually not at the Gunny waypoint yet, so that means we captured the glide slope a little early. But if we didn't, we just basically need to make sure that when we get to Gunny, that we are on the glide slope, and we already are, so we're in good shape. You can see that our altitude's being handled by the autopilot, and I'm just lowering our throttle and making sure that we're going. Okay, so they cleared us to land, and they gave us the wind information. So I'm just managing our throttle and our flaps right now. Now, if you were doing this manually, you would just look at this instrument here, the ILS instrument, and you would make left and right adjustments based on this vertical line. If it was left, you would need to go to the left. If it's right, you go to the right. And then the horizontal line with the glide slope, you would just use your throttle. So if the line is higher, that means you need to add some throttle, because remember, you pitch for speed and use throttle for climbing and descending. So if the line was above the center, we would add a little throttle. And if it was below the center, the horizontal, when it was down, we need to lose altitude, so we'd pull out a little bit of throttle. gonna go ahead and put in another knots of flaps here. And I'm just watching my airspeed to make sure that we're coming in at a good airspeed here. We don't want to come in too fast or too slow. So I want to be around 80. And for touchdown, I want to be a little below 70, maybe 65 or so. And I put in our final notch of flaps. I'm just keeping my eye on the airspeed indicator, keeping my eye on the altitude, keeping my eye on the ILS instrument, just making sure that the autopilot is still working. We're still perfectly on course, which we are because those are both centered. And I'm making sure that I'm giving it enough throttle with the flaps out so we're at a good airspeed. Now we won't stall unless we're under 40 in this aircraft, but our landing speed should be around 60 to 70. And it's up to you when you disable autopilot. You can wait until it gets almost all the way down and touching the ground before you just flare the nose up a little bit when you're cutting the power to idle. And that's just a procedure you do in the Cessna 172. But I'm just gonna let it bring us down really far just to demonstrate kind of how cool it is and how precise the ILS is. So I'm cutting the throttle a little bit more here, and we're about to be at 300 feet. Again, just keeping my eye on the airspeed. Those beeps you're hearing are actually part of the ILS system telling us that we're at the inner marker, which is pretty much at the threshold of where the runway starts. 200 feet. I'm gonna go ahead and turn off autopilot right here and just fly it down this little last bit. And the throttle's at idle. Just keeping the nose up a little bit. That was a little rough. I'm still working on my landings too. And now we'll hear from air traffic control and they'll give us taxi instructions. So I've gone ahead here after I've finished the flight and I've deleted the flight plan using the 530. And I just want to show you how to do this in the 530 if you want to do it manually instead of using the world map. Now remember, if you do it with the 530 right now in Flight Sim version 1.10.8.0, that air traffic control will not let you file an IFR flight plan. It's only VFR that you can file it as. So I definitely recommend using the world map if you can. But if you want to practice entering the flight plan here, we'll go ahead and do that now for the flight we just did. So I'm going to go ahead and just hit direct to, and I'm going to choose Long Beach by entering KLGB. And then I hit enter, and then I hit the cursor on and move down to activate, press enter. So now our flight plan is just from our current waypoint to Long Beach. So if we want to add the ILS approach, we click the procedures button down here, proc, click that. We go ahead down to select approach and hit enter. ILS 30 is right. And then a transition point of mids is also what we used. So I can leave that alone too. If you need to change either one, you just use the small dial on the right side here, the inner dial. That'll bring up the page and then use the outer dial to actually select one. So we've chosen ILS 30. The transition, that's the first point we hit on our GPS. And which one you pick just depends on your route and how efficient you want your route to be from your departure airport. So in our case, when we were to the east of here, the mids waypoint made more sense. So I'll just use mids, hit enter, and then press the load button here by pressing enter again. Now if we look at our flight plan, you can see that it's broken it up into two sections, the en route waypoints, and then below that, just like we saw before, we have the approach section. So then if we scroll down, we can see the same waypoints we saw before, mids, Lucig, and Gunny, and then runway 30. So then, like I showed before, you can go in and find the localizer frequency by going back to the home screen, holding clear to get back there, change to the second page group, which is waypoint. And then I had pre-selected this before, but you can input your waypoint here and then go to page 3 and look up the ILS frequency here at the bottom, 110.3. All right, I hope you guys found this video helpful on flying an ILS approach. If you have any questions or comments or recommendations for the next videos, please feel free to let me know below. Thanks so much for all the kind words on the other videos. I appreciate it. Have a good one.